So one of my patrons, Hugh Mungus said, yeah, my question would be, how do you manage to be neutral and not side with one or the other factional side? I am not talking about ideology, that's BS, but about simply fact or staying above all and just analysing fact and sources to put them together, if you know what I mean. Thanks. So there's a lot to unpack with this particular question, and I'm probably not going to be able to cover all of it. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to discuss, I guess, the history theory mindset. And if you haven't watched my previous video on what is history, where I begin the theory of history, because I want to do a series on the theory of history, which bias and source analysis is actually going to be a part of it. So this will actually be covered in a future video, and I'll probably do it more in depth than this. I can probably do it today, but I'll give it a good shot today. So if you haven't watched that other video, go and check it out. But essentially, the thing is, you said about, I'm not talking about ideology, you just want to know about the sources. Well, the thing is, if you haven't got a neutral ideology, quote unquote, if you haven't got a neutral mindset going into it, if you're biased, if you don't know your own biases and understand why you're biased, and you don't have the, let's say, process in order to get away from those biases, then it doesn't matter, because you will approach those sources with a particular bias, right? So if you are, let's say, a Nazi, you're going to look at a source and be like, well, that's stupid because it doesn't agree with Hitler, or whatever. And so you're going to approach the sources bias and dismiss certain sources because they are that sort of thing and not this sort of thing, and it's not a good way to go about it. So what you actually need is an ideology yourself, which is probably a scientific ideology, or a more neutral ideology, and you'll see why when I describe it. So what I'm going to do is I'm not just going to give you the how to approach sources. I'm going to do that towards the middle or the end of this video, but I'm actually going to tell you about this mentality you need to have going into it, and in life in general, because I think it's a very good ideology to have, especially if you're in a scientific, academic, sort of job or studying. I think this will help you a lot. So I'm going to go through that, because this leads then to the sources themselves, and you'll see why when I've explained it all. Oh, actually, yeah, if I have this mentality, when I approach sources, I've got a much better chance of not skewing the evidence and my perception and my interpretation of the evidence, because I've approached this in a way that mitigates most of the bias and so on and so forth. And then we'll talk about the sources themselves and what to look out for and that sort of thing. So let's begin by describing the mindset you kind of need to have. And it's going to sound stupid, but we're going to go right back to basics. So I am human, and I am an individual, and you're an individual, and everybody else around us are all individuals, which means we are unique in the world, and we all have certain personalities and certain, thoughts, and we're all physically different somehow. None of us look the same. Even if we've got a twin, there's always a bit of a difference. So we're all kind of unique in that sense. We're all one. We're all individuals, right? And so we are not groups. We are not a race. I'm not a race, right? My race is irrelevant, because it's not. My gender is not irrelevant. Unless we're going on a date, my gender is irrelevant, right? And if, I'm British, I have a British passport, but I don't eat limes. Excuse me, shopkeep, can we have a lime, please? Like, it just doesn't happen. It never happens. So I guess I'm not British, and I'm not a class, even though I come from the lowest of the low, probably, you could probably say. Maybe not low. Slightly above tramp is where I come from. So I'm working class, if you think of that. But I reject the idea of class, because we're not groups, we are individuals. And so I don't look at somebody else and go, you're a race, or you're a sex, or you're a class, or a nationality. I don't see any of that, because I see everyone as individuals. Now, I do use the term German to describe the Germans, because it's easier than me going, individuals who inhabit Germany have a common language, and okay, Germans, it's there for convenience, but it still doesn't mean that the Germans are all the same. There's no way all Germans wear, I don't know, what are those things called? I can't even remember what they're called. I don't see stereotypes. It's, all British people are POMs. I don't even know what a POM is. So it's just stupid. It just doesn't make any sense, right? So I don't see the world in groups, and as a result, I see everyone as individuals, which means I judge everybody's individuality. And that means I don't support the group. I don't support the Germans. I don't support the British or the Russians or this ideology or this church or this whatever gender. Right? Oh, boys are better than girls. Like, what are you, 12? Oh, TIK's being ageist now. I don't support age, right? Age is just a number. So this whole thing is like to basically say we're all individuals. So as a result, I don't care about the groups, right? I use them only as a convenience, British is just the group. In the Crusader video, I said, oh, the British are doing this. It's like, actually, some of them were Indians, and some of them were New Zealanders, and some of them were Australians, and some of them... Because British was the overall term, it's just easier than going, the British and the English, Welsh, Irish, Scots, I'd be there forever, every single time. So this tank, which was British and Irish, and, there's no chance. It's not going to happen. So I use the groups for convenience. I don't use it as a definite thing. So as a result, I have no affiliation with any group. I will happily call Churchill an idiot because he was. I will happily say he's a drunk. I will happily criticise Montgomery or praise him if there's a particular thing. Like Auchinleck, he was good in Crusader. I have to say he was good in Crusader. He might be rubbish in the later periods of the war, probably. I've heard that he is. But in Crusader, he was good. So in that instance, even then, it's like, I'm not even favouring this guy. He was good in Crusader. I will praise him for that. If he's bad later on, I'll criticise him for it. Same with O'Connor. He was great in Operation Compass. Probably the best victory of the war for the British. Go and watch my video on it if you haven't done so already. Great guy in that, but later on in the war wasn't so good. I have no problem. I have no problem criticising the British. I have no problem criticising other men. I have no problem criticising other working class people. Or anyone. I have no problem criticising anybody. And this is the point. I criticise everyone. It's people like, oh, you criticise the German general so much. It's like, yes. I wonder why. Because I'm critical of everybody. Because this is how I remain neutral. I say, no, I'm going to criticise these people. I'm going to criticise everybody. When I think that they've done a good job, I'll praise them for it. And if they've not done a good job, then I won't. And so this ideology, this we are an individual, this is classic liberalism. Because I don't think anybody should be judged by their skin colour or sex or anything like that. And this is what classic liberalism is about. It's about actually we're all individuals. And so this means that because we're all individual, we're not guilty by association. So I'm not guilty because somebody who's white commits a crime. It's like if they commit a crime, they go to jail. I don't go to jail for it. That's ridiculous. So it's like, some Germans, I'm using German as a convenience, some Germans or some Nazis committed a crime in World War II, therefore all Germans are evil. Like, no. All Russians are evil. Like, no, that's not. No. All British people, are evil because they had an empire. Like, no, that's not how it works. I hate my government as much as you hate my government, right? That's how it works because, I didn't commit any crimes as far as I'm aware. Probably several. I haven't committed any crimes, so why should I get sent to jail for it? Like, that doesn't make any sense. And this is the mentality that goes down, this is how the Germans murdered the Jews, because they were like, well, they are, this is the ideology. They are a different group. We don't respect the individuality. We no longer see them as human. We see them as the group. They're the evil, right? The evil Jews or bourgeoisie or whatever you want to call it. It's like, oh, they're evil, therefore we must kill them. And that's what it is. It's you no longer see them as human. You see them as groups. You take away their identity. You take away their rights. You end up murdering them. And this happens so many times. And it's all because of the, look back in the religious wars. It's like, they are them and we are this. It's just, why are you dividing society? Why is there a schism, right? This is what happens. So to remain neutral as a whole thing, you look at every individual, which means then when you look at the sources, you go, well, is this historian telling the truth? You look at him as an individual, or her as an individual. You look at what they're saying. Have they based it on what evidence? Is the evidence likely to be biased? You look at a primary source document, you do the same thing. You go, well, what is their purpose? What are they writing for? What is their thought process? Why are they doing it? When did they do it? Put it in context, and you say, well, what is and because you've got this mentality, or at least I have, of this mentality of, actually, I'm going to judge this person as an individual. I'm going to understand what he says, and then say I'm going to criticize it and see what the flaws are in the logic or the argument or whatever else. And by doing this, you end up coming away better off than you would. Now, you can't necessarily do it for everything, but I think you can do it for most things. And the more you read on something, the more you understand the biases and the agendas and blah, 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 blah. So it's about, you need to use a lot of sources. You need to be critical with every single one of them. And then you kind of get the flow of it. You go, actually, I can trust David Glantz from the most part, although Jason DeMark at least once does counter him. And the way he does it is pretty good. So in that instance, I might favour Mark, because Glantz is great, but he's not infallible, right? So even then, it's like, I praise Glantz and I think he's amazing. I think you should get his books. However, he does make mistakes. We all do. We're all human, right? And that's the point. It's like, we're all human. We're all individuals. No one's a god. We all make mistakes. And so these authors and these primary sources and these whatever, they can all make mistakes as well. So by not associating myself with a group and by staying individual, I no longer, and not really having much of an ideology beyond the scientific classic liberalism ideology, there is no need or reason to be biased or have an agenda beyond wanting to do a good job, which is one of the basic elements of this. So that's how I kind of remain neutral in this. What I also do is I look at both sides of the argument. There might be more than one side. There might be like 3 arguments, but let's just go with, so the 2 arguments. So what I tend to do is try and build up both sides of the argument to as good as they can possibly be, and then see which one makes more sense, or see which one is more flawed. And I do this with everything. So if I come out and go in, I think this is right, here you go, it's because I have looked at the other side. So if you watch my Purges video, this is the video where I think I did it the best, quote unquote, or at least for the time I did it really well. And I presented both sides of the argument. And so I was like, well, this is the argument for the Purge, and then this is the argument that I'm going to present, which is against the Purge, roughly speaking. And it's like, oh, okay, so he's actually done both sides. Now, a lot of time on YouTube, it's not really practical for me to do that because it just isn't. So I come out and go, here you go, right? And for the most part, like for example, in Operation Crusader, one of the first things is that the day it begins, most of the sources, let's say 9 out of 10 sources, say it's raining, and one source says it's not raining. Did I say this in the video? No, because it's not relevant, right? Because it doesn't matter. But it was probably raining for most of the units, but maybe 1 or 2 of them it didn't rain for. So that's the answer to that one. But you could, as a whole, you could say, well, it was raining this day, or it rained overnight, or whatever, or it cleared up in the morning, or whatever it was. But it's like, that's, there's no need to mention this in the video. However, if you look at the Bruneville video, halfway through the video, I go, right, stop, let's talk for 10 minutes about this, because this is a major decision, right? Which may impact the way we perceive the entire battle. Oh, okay, this is important, I need to discuss this and present either side of the argument. So I did it there as well as in with John Frost. So that's very good. And with the recent curling videos, the same thing's applied. It's like, okay, what was Army Group North trying to retreat or not? Here's the kind of argument, but then actually here's some of the flaws in this, which is why I think that, and that's how I do it. I kind of look at both sides and go, well, which one's better? Because this is the problem you say about ideology. If you don't have this mentality of, I'm an individual, I'm not a social group, I don't believe in, class or whatever, if you say, actually, I'm an individual, I have no affiliation with that, so then you are less likely to praise or give more time to that particular thing, if that makes sense. So you can say, I don't know, let's just say hypothetically, so you're British, right? And so you therefore, I'm going to, you will biasly, you will look at more British things because, I look at the North African campaign. I started it because I wasn't, if I'm honest, when I started the North African campaign, I wasn't that interested in it. But when I started looking at it, what I decided was, I'm going to go through this, and I was more inclined to look at it because I'm British, right? So the influence is there. However, and there's obviously English sources, I was looking into that, and I wanted to see how Montgomery was compared to the earlier generals. So that's the reason why I got into it. But I knew going into it that I wouldn't just praise the British when they didn't deserve it. And I knew that. So while they did really well in Compass, I then criticised them quite heavily, especially in Crusader. They got, with the exception of one or two of the guys and whatever, I criticised the British all the way through it. The first thing I did was criticise Churchill, right? So I have no affiliation. While it might influence my decision to do a particular topic, it doesn't influence because I have no stake in it, if that makes sense. I have no, I don't regard myself as British because I got a passport, I must defend my country. It's like, even if I was patriotic, even if it was like, yeah, okay, I'll fight for the country, that doesn't mean I have to necessarily think we are all the same. I'm sorry, we're not, okay? 5 minutes in retail will give you a very big perspective of how we are not the same. There is no way that these people around me in Britain are the same. There's no way. They're just not happening, right? So that's the way I see it. So I have no reason to defend it. And plus, if I'm more critical of my own country and my own class, my own sex and my own, what's the last one? Race, right? If I'm more critical of that, then I'm going to get a more rounded perspective, and that's the point as well. Because if I was British and I was sided with the British, then you're going to come out with the wrong answer. And ultimately, because we are all individuals, I want the correct answer for myself, not for my group, because I have no reason to defend a group. So. And this goes back to what I said in that video. History is the study of the human condition. It's the study of the human mind. It's the study of the human thought. And so, in a sense, it's the study of ourselves. It's not the study of the past per se. You can't study the past because it's gone, right? We're only receiving the records of the past, the leftovers, if that makes sense. So what we're actually doing is looking at the human mind and thus ourselves. So I want the best for myself. Obviously, I want the best for you guys. I want everybody to kind of learn from this and go forward and take the lessons of history, whatever they may be. And so I have no reason to twist that. I have no ideology or group in order to twist that. That's the benefit of this ideology of the classic liberalism of, no, I have no race, I have no nationality, I have no gender, I have, in terms of social and political groupings, I have none of that. I have no nationality, I have no class, I have no religion, I have nothing, because I don't associate myself with those groups. So I have no reason to twist it. I have no reason to make it balanced. And when I see these people, I can see their biases. I can see their agendas. Because I can, look, Stalin is saying this about socialism. It's like, well, there you go then. I wonder why, right? So, and I can think, well, Hitler has got his racism. So when he's talking about race, it's like, oh, I wonder why, why did he conclude that the Soviets would just collapse? Is it because of his racism, right? Why did the German generals all think that the Soviets were so useless? Is it because of their racism or their nationality or something? It's like, ooh, maybe that's part of it, right? So that's how I kind of, and then I'll go, well, is this really the case? I'll go and check it. But that's how I remain neutral. It's by just simply not favouring one side or another, because I don't associate myself with one side or another. So now that we've got a neutral perspective, at least approaching the sources, we can now sort of analyze how to do the sources themselves. Now here's my opinion on this, and this is going to probably cause a bit of controversy, or there might be some disagreement. I think you should study the secondary sources first before you study the primary sources. That is actually against the Rankinian idea, because they say you have to immerse yourself in the primary sources first. The problem with doing the primary sources first is that you haven't realised where the primary sources are skewed. The historians can generally point out, hey, this source is biased, or this person is biased, or this person's got the perspective. They can generally do that, so you've got more of an idea. You need to read a lot of the secondary sources. You need to compare and contrast. So even though I favour glance, I will still always look at, let's say, Jason DeMark and see if there's another alternative argument. They might not go together somehow, or there might be, different perspectives, and that's fine. We can do that. But if you read multiple sources, you'll get loads of different perspectives, and you generally start to, get this idea in your head of how a battle or how a personal topic or whatever ends up moving, and you can see the alternative arguments. So you need to use the secondary sources, use a lot of them, probably get as many books as you possibly can do on the subject. You can then start using the primary sources, and in general what you want to do is gather as many sources as you possibly can do. Now, this isn't always possible, especially if you've got a huge topic, so in which case you kind of have to prioritize and whatever else. But I would probably be saying, depending on how many words, let's say if you're writing an essay, how many words you need to write, you need to be looking at 10 books, 20 books, 30 books, 40, it's in the teens at least. Depends on what, if it's a 1,000-word essay, maybe not, but if you're looking at a few thousand words, you need to use 20 sources, something like that, maybe more. Depends on the topic. Some sources, some topics don't have as many books, like Curlin, goddammit. But a lot do, so I would actually recommend you get as many books as you possibly can, but prioritise and get the books that you think are the most relevant or would be, and the sources that would be most relevant and whatever else. Once you've kind of done that, my recommendation is that you, as I say, read them, understand what they're saying, make notes about them, and type away, put it on a docs file, do a separate docs file for each one, and get their understanding of whatever they're arguing. Oh, they're arguing A, that's fine, they're not arguing B, okay, and then the next source, oh, they're arguing B and they're saying A is a load of rubbish. And you can see what the arguments are saying, basically. So what will end up happening is you'll get an understanding of argument A, and then you'll get an understanding of argument B, and then what you'll do is, by maintaining your neutrality, you'll eventually get more and more evidence on both sides, more interpretations, more arguments, and so on and so forth, to the point where, okay, you're running out of sources now, and you've pretty much covered all the bases, and what you've done is you've built up argument A to be as really good as it possibly can be, and argument B to as really good as it possibly can be. And during this process, you're not making your decision. It's like, Marky Gardner's the typical one I always go back to. Argument A, well, the British were at fault entirely, it's a bad plan, it was poorly executed, blah, blah, blah. So that's a really good argument. It's like, yeah, I don't necessarily disagree. However, argument B is, oh, this kind of overwhelms this neutralizes this. So while this is all correct, this is a superior argument, so I'm going to favour this. Now, you can still argue this, and the argument that Gavin didn't mess up or whatever, we can have discussions about this. This isn't 100%, and that's where the debate comes in, which is what I talked about in that video about what is history. Debate is good, because if we go back and forth with these two arguments, eventually one will go lower down than the other argument, and therefore we'll favour that one over the other one. Although there might be evidence that eventually pulls this one back up, or a new interpretation, so we've got to be careful there. But the point of what I'm saying is that you can get those arguments together, and it doesn't really matter which side you favour as long as it's the one that you see as the better argument. And this is another thing as well. Because you're approaching this neutrally, because you're not biased and don't have an agenda, to actually promote a specific cause, then you're not necessarily invested in whatever it is, the conclusion you've come to. So I'm not heavily invested in the idea that Gavin was the one absolutely to blame for them. I said this in the video. It's like, if new evidence and interpretations come along that beat my conclusion, I will adapt, I will change. And there's no problem with that. There's absolutely no problem with that, because I'm not invested in, I don't know, let's say anti-Americanism or something, right? It's like, I hate Gavin because he's an American. It's like, no, I'm not interested. If an argument is better than mine, I will go, I'm going for it. That's it. Done. Right? Because I have no stake in the way, whichever argument wins. I have no stake in the discussion, really, beyond I want to make good videos and good history, and I want to put those and get people discussing this so we can see what... Because the thing is, if we're having a debate, eventually one side will win, right? And I want the best side to win, because whoever wins, that's probably more likely to be the correct way to look at history. So it benefits me if I lose an argument. It actually does, because either I get stronger as a person by knowing that I was wrong and, okay, that's definitely the conclusion, or we all benefit because maybe I win, and then, it's not... There's no problem there. There's no problem whether I win or not. And there's no problem whether you win or not. And you should approach this. And this is the way scientists approach their evidence. Now, they've got it a little bit differently because there's not as much interpretation. Like, history is all about interpretation of the evidence. And I mentioned this in that video as well. So you got your evidence first, you build up your evidence, then you do your interpretation of the evidence. And is the evidence, in history, it's like, we can interpret the evidence because there's no concrete way. We can't study the past because the past is gone. There's no concrete past to study. So if our evidence isn't available, we can't grab more from thin air. We can't reinvent the past. We have to just find more evidence, which there might not be available. So some questions will go unanswered, which means it will have a massive impact on the way we perceive the world. Whereas with science, if I stop breathing, will I die? Well, you can do that experiment as many times as you want, right? You can do it right now, because that's something you can repeat. You can repeat it. You can touch the present. Science is all about the present, whereas history is about the past, which you can't touch. So we have the traces of the past, not the actual past itself. And that's, history isn't the study of the past. It's the study of the traces of the past, which is why it's the human consciousness, because the only things that we have about the past are the things that humans left for us, records, buildings, armor, whatever else. It's the traces of the past that we're studying, not the past itself. A lot of people seem to get this wrong. So when we invent a time machine and can go back in time, that's when we'll be able to study the past. But we can't do that until we are able to travel time. So in the meantime, history is about the study of what humans recorded of the past. So the way scientists approach it is they go, here's a bunch of evidence, therefore this, right? And if there is another scientist out there who has a better evidence or more evidence or better theory or whatever else, and that triumphs over your theory or evidence, then you just accept it. So I think the Earth is flat. Here's all the evidence that counters that. Oh, I've learned something today. The Earth is not flat. I will now go... And your reputation is not ruined as a scientist unless you then go, no, I think it's flat and I'm going to stand here even though the evidence is overwhelming. Then it's like, well, you're not a real scientist because you're not going where the evidence leads you. And it's the same with history to some extent, but unfortunately the evidence isn't always available, and a lot of it's down to interpretation. But the same thing applies. You have to be adaptable, which means while you can argue, and you can argue strongly, you shouldn't be so invested in the idea that you're putting forward. And look, it's kind of hard, but I would probably say believe, or shall I say, go with the flow, but be prepared to change if and when new evidence or interpretations come along that sort of are better than your current perception. Now, when it comes to the sources themselves, every source, you've got to remember this, every source is biased. Every source has got an agenda. It could be a good agenda. For me, I want to tell the truth about history, so that's a good agenda. It is still an agenda, though, because I do want to tell the truth about history. Oh no, it's evil, TIK is evil. I say, no, there are good agendas and bad agendas. Now, there could just be an agenda, I want to publish a book and make a lot of money, so then they're like, Kursk is the greatest battle of all time. It's like, no, it isn't. Alright? So you've got to be careful with that. But if you approach every single source with the idea of, well, what are they trying to do? What is their ideology, if they have one? What is their bias? What is their perspective? What is their agenda? Who are they? Where are they writing? What date, time? Why are they writing it? Who are they writing it for? Is it for themselves? Is it for history? Are they trying to paint a particular narrative? Have they been influenced by other people? Is it a primary source? Is it a secondary source? You've got to ask all these questions, and there's loads of these questions with every single source. And obviously, if you're going back to the same person over and over again, you kind of get a feel for what they're trying to do. And this is where history comes in, and you say, actually, if you start specializing, you can really narrow down and understand the topic a lot better than a newbie coming to the topic who's not used enough sources. Because it's the thing, if you just use primary sources, it's like going in new. It's like starting over from scratch, and it's very, very bad, actually. I think it's really wrong to do that. I think you should use the secondary sources, then the primary sources, and so you get a much better perspective. That doesn't mean that the primary sources might change your perspective of the secondary sources. That's happened to me. But I think it should be the other way around. I think secondary sources first, then primary sources, for that reason, so you get the grasp of history. And so when you approach each source, and it's like, well, this source is saying one thing, this source is saying another, this is saying something else, and it's like, well, actually, over time, you might find that if you've got 10 sources, 8 of them might all agree, and these other 2 might not. And it's like, well, what are the other 2 saying? Is their argument, does it make more sense than over the other 8? Because a consensus doesn't mean anything, right? If everybody in the world thinks the world is flat, the world does not become flat, okay? That's not how it works. And people are like, oh, my, if I say something controversial, it's like, oh, your reputation's ruined. It's like, no, because the consensus is irrelevant. If my argument is good and it trumps yours, then that's it. That's all that matters. It's very hard to teach people how to think critically. And I've kind of talked about this in the past, but it's just not possible. And this is where the interpretation comes in. This is the difference between science and then interpretation. And science is all about evidence. History is about evidence and interpretation. So you've got to get that interpretation down. And that's the hard part. So, and I've kind of covered it a bit in this, but yeah, in my opinion, the best way to remain neutral is to have this idea of we're all individuals, we're not part of a group, we don't associate with other people in that sense, social, economic, political, whatever else. We don't do that. What we do is we approach every single topic with the idea of trying to find the truth, and we don't want to skew that, because if we skew it, we will not understand the past as history, we won't understand the historical concepts, we won't understand the human thought, because history is about what people wrote, and therefore we won't understand our own selves, and we won't understand human consciousness and the condition of humanity, which is what we're ultimately doing. So yeah, that's, in my opinion, the best way to do it. And then just compare and contrast the facts of the evidence and stuff like that. So I hope that answers your question, Hugh Mungus House. As I say, I will do this more in depth and probably more coherently in a future video. But yeah, if you haven't watched the other video about what is history, go and do that. I think it's a very good one. So thanks for watching. Bye for now.